So I want to talk about Wagner PMC. Wagner or Wagner is a military contractor in Ukraine. And they were supposed to be these elite special forces, kind of like mercenaries, these just fearsome fighters. And it turned out to be not so good. And there's a reason for it. And I'm going to try to unpack that. So if we roll back the clock to 2014, we find that Wagner was fighting in Donbass. And these were former soldiers and other mercenaries that were involved. And they've been involved in other places in the world as well. They've been involved in Syria, at least 3 other African countries. And in Ukraine started off as this special military operation, which Putin talked about. Well, there's really nothing to see here. It's just a special military operation, this little thing on the side. But over time, as he got bogged down, he started to draw more and rely more and more heavily on Wagner and let them be known and come out of the kind of the shadows. And along the way, they drafted prisoners. Now, they drafted prisoners who voluntarily, you could get out of jail. And if you survive in 6 months in Wagner, then you'd be free from your prison sentence if you survive. But your likelihood of surviving is not going to be that good. So they drafted upwards of maybe 40,000 or so prisoners. And that swelled the ranks to roughly 50,000, according to the U.S. State Department. So out of that 50,000, most of their effort has been around Bakhmut. At least in the last 5 or 6 months, most of their effort has been focused on Bakhmut, a small town of less than 100,000 that they could not take. There's only about 6,000 remaining in the city, but they could not take the city in 6 months. Now, in that time, they had 30,000 casualties. Now, think about that. 30,000 casualties out of total of 50,000. What's going on? And a majority of those were prisoners. And of those 30,000, about 9,000 were killed. And of those killed, about 90% were prisoners. So what's happening? Well, there's a couple of things happening, and it all has to do with leadership. First, there's poor training. If you know that you only have these people for 6 months, you're not going to take 5 months to train them and get very little bit out of them. You're going to throw them into the fight. So they went into a meat grinder somewhat unprepared. It doesn't matter because, hey, look, they're just prisoners. And that's the mentality. In 6 months, they get their freedom anyway. And you want to spend them as much as you can. You're not thinking about being economical with their lives. You're thinking about their time before they're free. And when they're free, they mean nothing to you. When they're on the battlefield, they're at least useful to go charge the enemy. But what happens in 6 months? If you're a murderer and you go to Wagner and you get free in 6 months, is there justice for the person who's been killed in Russia? So again, they're not really thinking about that. So there's poor training to start with. There's also a low value on human life. And then there's this idea that the end doesn't justify the means. But here we have both means that are terrible, which is using these prisoners to do your fighting, and an end that's even worse. So the ends and means are both wrong in this case. But there's one big winner here with Wagner, and that is Prigozhin. He's the guy in charge, or he's at least the PR face. He's not really a hardened fighter like he likes to project that he is. He's just the PR, the titular head of the organization. And he was a supporter of Putin. He was known as Putin's chef because he owned a catering business, and he was ingratiating himself to Putin and then created Wagner. And in the process, he was somewhat empowered by Putin. He got Putin's permission, certainly, in order to get the convicts to infuse his ranks so that he could go and take the fight to the enemy. But now he's somewhat of a threat to Putin, and there's even talk of him potentially replacing Putin after Putin. So as he's become a threat, Putin has choked off the amount of prisoners that he's able to acquire, and so PMC Wagner will become more and more irrelevant. But in the meantime, the misery of this, as far as a focus on leadership goes, is that he's made his name on the dead bodies of these Russians. Like, he's trying to ingratiate himself to Putin by killing thousands of people in a cause that's not just. And he's objectifying these human beings, using them like they're less than human in order to make his name. And since you can't recruit prisoners anymore, he's going to be less and less of a force. I'm sure he's going to try to find a way to ingratiate himself by being a public figure, but it's not going to work. He's going to try to do what he can to stay relevant. But that's a background of what's going on with Wagner PMC. I remember when Wagner was first introduced on the battlefield, and I thought, wow, these guys are in the fight too. But now I think, wow, these guys are in the fight too? Like, they're just going to get slaughtered. Now, one last thing, 30,000 casualties from Wagner PMC alone, 9,000 of those casualties killed, and 90% of those killed were prisoners. Now, that kill rate is almost as bad as a decade in Afghanistan, and that's Wagner PMC alone, let alone the Russian military with all their problems. That's what you need to understand about Wagner. So I hope my explanation of Wagner and why it's fighting so terribly makes some sense. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.